Hi, I'm Lauren Watt, and welcome to this special edition of One-on-One with Watt. It's a known fact that the U.S. Civil War tore this nation in half, pitting the North against the South in a bitter struggle that will leave an indelible print on American history. However, very few people are aware that Missouri played a leading role in provoking the Civil War. In fact, it was a St. Louis couple, according to historians, that pushed this nation to the very brink of war. Who were they? Well, they weren't politicians or even abolitionists, but slaves named Dred and Harriet Scott. Today, we'll go back to where it all started, right here at the old courthouse in St. Louis, and we'll discover how Dred and Harriet Scott, mere Missouri slaves, incited an entire nation and altered the course of American history. Next, on One-on-One with Watt. Dred Scott was born into slavery in Virginia in 1799 as the property of the Peter Blow family. In 1830, the Blow family moved to Missouri and took their slave, Dred Scott, with them. However, the Blow family's transition to their new Missouri home wasn't an easy one. Bob Moore, a historian for the National Park Service, which staffs and maintains the old courthouse, explains.
When they got here, they bought a hotel and kind of fell on hard times, and Peter Blow decided to sell Dred Scott. And so he sold him to a physician who worked for the Army, who was kind of contracted by the Army, named Emerson, John Emerson. And so Emerson became Dred Scott's owner.
While the property of Dr. Emerson, Scott traveled extensively into Illinois and Wisconsin, areas which were considered free territories.
Whenever the Army transferred Emerson, he was obviously bound to go, and so he went to a couple forts. One was Fort Armstrong, which was in Illinois, and the other was Fort Snelling, which was then in the territory of Wisconsin, but today is in the state of Minnesota. And so Dred Scott was stationed at both those places with his owner.
It was during these travels that Dr. Emerson and Scott, both bachelors, met and married their wives. Dr. Emerson married Irene Sanford, while Scott took Harriet Robinson, who was also a slave, as his new bride.
They were actually legally married, which at that time, legally married under terms of the Anglo laws and by a minister was kind of unusual for slaves. And when Harriet Robinson married Dred Scott, Dr. Emerson actually purchased her as well from her owner, who was another Army officer.
In 1842, when Dred Scott was 43 years old, he and Harriet returned to Missouri with Dr. and Mrs. Emerson. 1 year later, however, Dr. Emerson died, leaving his wife's brother, John Sanford, as the executor of the Emerson estate. Several years after Dr. Emerson's death, Dred and Harriet decided to make their move. In 1846, they walked into this St. Louis courthouse and signed a petition suing for their freedom and the freedom of their two daughters.
In St. Louis, one of the main reasons why slaves sued for their freedom was because they had been taken by their masters to free territory and lived there, and then brought back to St. Louis, brought back to a slave state, and kept in slavery during the whole time. So basically they were challenging the laws of other states and of this state and saying, all right, we lived in a place where we're supposed to be free, we're not supposed to be enslaved, and so because of that you have to set us free. And basically the Missouri courts honored the laws of other states and other areas, other territories in what's now the United States that said that no slavery could exist in those areas, and they would set slaves free who sued under this law. They kind of had a catchphrase. They called it once free, always free.
Records show that more than 250 Missouri slaves sued for their freedom prior to the Civil War, and of those, about half were actually freed.
Well, they sued for their freedom in 1846, and the case came to trial in 1847. They got to the trial, everything was going along fine. I'm sure their lawyers were saying it's an open and shut case, because we've even had another case of a slave woman named Rachel who sued for her freedom 10 years ago, and she was brought to the same exact forts where Dred Scott was, because her owner was also an Army officer. And she won her case, and on appeal she won her case in the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is an open and shut case. This husband and wife, Dred and Harriet Scott, you want to sue for your freedom? No problem, you're going to get it.
However, much to Dred and Harriet's dismay, the case would prove to be much more difficult.
Well, they get into court, and their main witness, their star witness, it turns out, does not have personal knowledge of Dred Scott's ownership. His wife does. So his testimony is ruled out as hearsay testimony, and they lose the case.
Down, but not out, Dred and Harriet continued their fight for freedom.
So the lawyer, their lawyer, immediately appeals to the judge for a new trial, not to rehear the same trial, and not an appeal. He wants a new trial because of this hearsay evidence, and the judge actually grants that, which is a big break for the Scotts. Otherwise, their case would have ended right there.
Stalled by legal red tape, a cholera epidemic, and the Great Fire of 1849, Dred and Harriet Scott spent several years in the custody of the court and were contracted out as slaves while they waited for their next trial.
Participating in foster care is a profound experience for the youth involved and for their foster parents. It's hard work, challenging, frustrating, often difficult, never easy. But the rewards can be overwhelming.
If you feel you have what it takes to be a foster care parent, visit dss.mo.gov.
Some dogs fetch and roll over. Some dogs take you to Spain and shopping for refrigerators, help you get through grad school, start your own business, go on hikes in the Grand Canyon. Some dogs you trust with your life every day. Being partners with a guide dog is having the freedom to do what you want in life. Nothing more, nothing less. And with your help, nothing need ever change that. Call 1-888-884-DOGS or visit guidedogs.com.
Don't walk. Don't walk. Walk. Do not enter. Hot dogs. Definitely like hot dogs. Motorcycle club. Everything must go. Ghostly ghouls. Don't look at that, Teddy. Body piercing. Ouch.
Everyday moments can become teaching moments because learning starts long before school does. Give your child the start they need at bornlearning.org.
Mom, shouldn't we pick a place to meet? If you're not home, should we go to the neighbors? Should I pick up Sophia at the babysitter's house?
There's no reason not to have a plan in case of a terrorist attack.
How do we keep in touch with each other if the phones don't work?
And some extremely good reasons why you should.
If we can't make it home, who will pick us up?
Talk to your family about what you would do in case of an emergency. For more information, go to www.ready.gov.
Lynn Jackson is a St. Louis native and a direct descendant of Dred and Harriet Scott.
I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Dred and Harriet Scott. each one of them had children, and my mom and dad had 4 kids, and that's how I got here.
When asked why Dred and Harriet Scott didn't just run away to get their freedom, Lynn replied,
Well, honestly, I think that it has to do with their character. I truly believe that they were people of integrity, and I do believe that they felt that it was the right thing to do to stay here and fight the case, even if they didn't win, and of course we know they lost several times, but to have the gumption to get up and do it again, to go through it again, to get knocked down and get back up again. You know, that's the way it had to be, and I think that they not only did it for themselves, but they did it for others.
Finally, in 1850, another trial. These are jury trials. There's 12 men sitting there. They're all white guys. Some of them are probably slave owners, and they're going to sit in judgment over whether Dred and Harriet Scott are going to have to go back to their owner or whether they're going to be set free because of this once free, always free idea. And in that case, Dred and Harriet Scott are set free. The jury hears the evidence, they feel no problem. You know, that Dred and Harriet Scott should no longer be slaves, so they're set free. But wait a minute, Mrs. Emerson's lawyer appeals, and that means that Dred and Harriet Scott have to stay in the custody of the court until the case is resolved.
Slavery had become a hotbed of controversy. With the occurrence of Bleeding Kansas, the Fugitive Slave Law, and the Missouri Compromise, Southerners feared the demise of slavery, while Northerners became increasingly agitated with its perpetuation.
There's a lot of antagonism between the North and the South, and in the state of Missouri, there's even a reorganization of the state Supreme Court. So by the time the case gets heard, we've got 3 justices on the Supreme Court, and 2 of them are pro-slavery. And when they hear the case, they decide that, okay, we've got this whole history of case law that's built up to this time, to 1852, and we keep letting all these slaves go because they set foot in free territory. Well, we're not going to honor the laws of other states anymore in Missouri. We're going to honor our own law, which says that we can have slaves. And so, Dred and Harriet Scott, you're going to have to remain slaves, because we're no longer going to just let slaves go because they were once in free territory. So Dred and Harriet Scott turn out to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Politically, the winds were shifting, and as they were looking at the nation expanding westward and whether or not slavery was going to expand westward or not, it became a political point that they could make this case an example and actually use it to stop, well, abolitionists would like to have stopped it, but the powers that be would like to continue slavery in the land, and they were getting opposition from abolitionists. So I believe with all my heart and with all that I've studied that they definitely did take this case and make it a trial, I guess, if you will, an example, and they decided that this is the case, that they were going to hinge whether or not we go forward in slavery or not.
The Supreme Court, the justices feel they have something to prove, that they're going to, make this declaration. The third justice, Hamilton Gamble, in his dissenting opinion, said that, this decision flies in the face of all previous law in the state of Missouri, and it's purely a political decision. But there was nothing that could be done, and so, Dred and Harriet Scott, because of that decision, get put back into slavery. But still, their case isn't over, and everybody in town knows that.
And no one knew more than renowned attorney Roswell Field.
Dred and Harriet Scott decide to launch another suit for their freedom, and this time they sue in federal court. And the reason that they do that, one of the reasons, is that a lawyer named Roswell Field approaches them. He's a resident of St. Louis, and he tells them, I think you guys have gotten a raw deal. So what we should do is we should sue in the federal court, and we can do that on the basis that your ownership has been transferred by Mrs. Emerson to her brother, a guy named John Sanford, and his legal residence is now New York City. So since he lives in New York and you're being held in bondage here in Missouri, we can sue in federal court.
In 1854, Dred and Harriet sued in the federal court. The federal court determined that they should remain slaves. So, Dred and Harriet followed their attorney's advice and appealed to the United States Supreme Court.
Roswell Field always knew that that's the direction that this case was going to go in. And he even was laying the groundwork by writing letters to Montgomery Blair in Washington, D.C., a lawyer who had practiced before the Supreme Court before and could argue the Scott's case in Washington. And so, you know, he laid all this groundwork so that when the case came up in 1856, and it was actually argued before the justices, that, you know, they would have representation there in Washington.
But how were Dred and Harriet able to afford their high-profile attorneys and finance their legal battle? John Madison, the father of Lynn Jackson and the great-grandson of Dred and Harriet Scott, is also an attorney. He says it's no secret how the Scotts financed their legal fight, with the help of Dred's first owners, the Blow family.
He was blessed to be employed with the family because later on he was employed. That really helped him to pursue his option for freedom. You would think that that would be a weird situation. Some people would, but I don't see anything weird about it. If you served a person faithfully for many years and you've gotten to know them, they've gotten to know you, there's got to be something developed there more than just like a handshake of friends or a master-servant relationship.
But time would tell if the Blow's financial support and expert legal counsel would finally help Dred and Harriet win their freedom.
I wish I could go back when I didn't need someone to do my hair, back when I could still say my husband's name, back when I could have called 911 but didn't, back when I first felt the warning signs of a stroke but did nothing. I wish I could go back, but I can't.
With a stroke, time lost is brain lost. At the first warning signs, take action immediately.
Gold medal swimmer Amanda Beard.
When I see the richness of life on Earth, I think how wonderful that we are both a part of nature and its guardian. I'm Amanda Beard, and it is very important to me that we continue to nurture this relationship.
When America's symbol, the bald eagle, was threatened with extinction, America responded with the Endangered Species Act. This law now protects more than 1,000 species, like grizzly bears and butterflies, whooping cranes and manatees. But as some species recover, others become imperiled.
As we celebrate the accomplishments of our Endangered Species Act, let us pledge to our children and our grandchildren that we will protect America's wildlife heritage for them.
Thanks, Amanda.
Join me and Defenders of Wildlife to help save something wild. Visit defenders.org.
This is Mississippi, where the spirit of a people is more powerful than any force of nature.
Mississippi is strong, is proud, is resilient.
Mississippi is B.B. King and Muddy Waters and Elvis Presley.
Mississippi's highbrow, down home, and slow cook.
Mississippi is hurting, is crying, is singing the blues.
But Mississippi needs your help. Please call the number on your screen or log on to the website and give what you can. Mississippi thanks you kindly.
And it wasn't until March of 1857 that the infamous Dred Scott decision was handed down by the Supreme Court. 7 of the justices agreed that Dred Scott should remain a slave. And their reasons were the things that were astounding and outraging to people of the time. Because they said basically that Dred Scott was a black man, he had no rights that a white man was bound to respect, that he couldn't even sue in the federal courts because no black man could ever be a citizen of the United States. And they invalidated the Missouri Compromise. This case just inflamed the entire country. People in the South felt even more hunkered down in their bunkers, you know, waiting for people to come try to take their slaves away. And people in the North felt that this was, you know, the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the next decision was going to be right in their face, saying that, you know, we can't tell people whether they can or can't own slaves. And so here you've got a slave, Dred Scott, and his wife Harriet, who are just trying to gain their freedom, who actually sparked the Civil War.
Later, in 1857, in an ironic twist of fate, Scott's slave owner, who had fought so tenaciously to keep them as slaves, Mrs. Irene Emerson, remarried and returned Dred Scott and his family to their original owners, the Blow family. Finally, after 11 years of court battles, the Blow family happily gave Dred and Harriet and their 2 daughters their freedom. We're now at the Circuit Court number 4 on the 2nd floor of the old courthouse. Now, this is the courtroom that Dred and Harriet were actually given their freedom by the Blow family. Let's go ahead and take a look. Now, this is the railing that separated the onlookers from the real court proceedings. You had your prosecuting and defense attorneys up there, a place for your jury over here. Dred and Harriet probably would have sat in the courtroom during that time, and I imagine it must have been really difficult for them to sit here and not be able to speak.
Oh, I'm sure it is, and you know, even when you have the privilege of speaking, it's hard to contain yourself from time to time, but they weren't allowed at all to speak under any circumstances, so it had to be a difficult ordeal, and to do that for 11 years in and out of the courtroom, I think it took a lot out of him. You know, he did die a year later, but he stood the test, and I'm proud of that.
Because Dred Scott died of tuberculosis only 1 year after receiving his freedom, many consider this story a tragedy, but not Dred Scott's descendant, John Madison.
That story needs to be told. It wasn't that he just went down there one day by himself and knocked on the door and went in and asked for a petition. This was a coming together of black and white people, one of the strongest come together situations, because you're going to attack the system.
You work at a law firm right across the street now in a very tall building. You can look out your window and see the steps of an old courthouse. That is really very eerie.
It's hard to describe, it really is, but there's a nostalgia there. In a way, I can envision what it must have been like. I come over here, and sometimes I envision selling slaves on the steps, what it might have been like. You know, and a lot of times people say things, but they don't really feel them until you stop and really think, you know, what if that was you standing on the steps with hardly any clothes on? Or what if that was you watching your husband or your wife being pulled away from you, going down the street, who knows where, never to be seen again? So those thoughts have to come to you from time to time, and they're not pleasant thoughts, but we don't want to forget that that's what happened. We just want to be sure that the future is brighter for everyone.